The wedding dress lay in bloody tatters at Celestine Ravencrest's feet as she collapsed onto the wooden steps of the stranger's porch, her sobs echoing across the empty Montana valley. Behind her, the church bells of Copperwind Township still rang out what should have been her wedding march. But Matthias Caldwell, her fiancé of 3 years, was probably halfway too. California by now with her cousin Delphine and every penny. From their joint savings account, rain began to fall in heavy droplets, mixing with her tears as she clutched the crumpled telegram that had shattered her world just minutes before she was to walk down. The aisle can't go through with it. Found real love. Don't follow us. And she didn't even know whose house she'd stumbled to in her blind flight from the church. The massive log structure sat alone at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by endless pastures where cattle grazed peacefully under storm clouds. All she knew was that her legs had given out here on these rough-hewn steps, and she couldn't seem to make them carry her any further. The front door opened with a creak that made her look up through her veil of tears. A man emerged, no, not just a man, but a mountain of flesh and bone that had to duck under his own doorframe, 6 feet and 8 inches of solid muscle. With shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and hands that looked like they could bend horseshoes, his dark hair hung loose around a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines, except for his eyes. Those were the soft gray of storm clouds, and they held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his intimidating size. "Ma'am." His voice rumbled like distant thunder, careful and concerned. "You hurt." Celestine tried to answer, but only a broken sob emerged. She was a sight, her ivory silk gown torn and mud-stained, her carefully arranged auburn curls falling in damp tangles around her shoulders, her face streaked with tears and ruined cosmetics. The giant Cowboy 4, that's what he had to be given. The vast ranch spreading out around them descended the steps with surprising grace for such a large man. He moved slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Name's Kodiak Stormwright," he said, settling his considerable frame on the step beside her, though he left careful distance between them. "And you look like someone who's had the worst day of her life." "I was supposed to be married," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "Supposed to be Mrs. Matthias Caldwell by now." "I don't even know where I am." "You're at the Stormwright Ranch," Kodiak said gently, "about 5 miles north of Copperwind. And from the looks of things, that Matthias fellow is the biggest fool in Montana territory." Something in his tone, not pity, but genuine anger on her behalf, made her look at him properly for the first time. He had to be in his early 30s, with the weathered skin of a man who worked outdoors and the kind of steady presence that made her feel inexplicably safer. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted, the words feeling like glass in her throat. "He took everything. Our money, our plans, our ... She couldn't finish the sentence. "Our future, dreams, her heart." Kodiak was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft, she almost missed it over the increasing rain. "When I saw you crying on my stairs, I knew I'm going to marry you," he whispered. Celestine's breath caught. "What did you say?" "Read." He turned to face her fully, rain beginning to darken his work shirt and drip from his hair. "I said when I saw you crying on my stairs, I knew I'm going to marry you." His voice was stronger now, more certain. "I know it sounds crazy, and I know you don't know me from Adam, but sitting here looking at you, I can see your whole future stretching out before us." "That's impossible," she breathed. "You don't even know my name." "Celestine," he said simply. "Celestine Ravencrest. You're the schoolteacher who came to Copperwind last spring to marry the banker's son. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when someone as beautiful as you arrives." Heat flooded her cheeks despite the cold rain. "You know about me?" "I know you've been teaching the children of 3 different ranches because the town school board couldn't agree on a location. I know you organized the church social that raised money for the widow Henderson when her husband died. I know you stood up to Mayor Blackstone when he tried to close the library." His eyes never left her face. "I know that any man stupid enough to leave you standing at the altar doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as you." The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. This stranger, this mountain of a man, was looking at her like she was precious, like she mattered, like she was worth defending. "I should go," she said weakly, though she made no move to stand. "This is madness. You can't just decide to marry someone you've never met." "Can't I?" He shifted closer, close enough that she could smell leather and pine and something indefinably masculine. "My grandmother always said you know your true mate the moment you see them. Said it's like lightning sudden, powerful, and impossible to ignore." "Your grandmother sounds like a romantic." She was also never wrong about people. His massive hand moved as if to touch her face, then stopped just short of her cheek. "Stay, at least until the storm passes. Let me prove I'm not just some crazy cowboy with delusions of grandeur." Celestine looked up at the darkening sky, then at the warm glow of lamplight spilling from his windows. She had nowhere else to go, no money for a hotel, even if Copperwind had one, and no family who would take her in after the scandal of being jilted at the altar. But more than that, something about Kodiak Stormwright made her feel safe in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Maybe it was his size or his obvious strength, or the way he looked at her like she was something worth treasuring instead of abandoning. "Just until the storm passes," she agreed, as he helped her to her feet, his hand engulfing hers completely. She couldn't help but wonder if she was making another terrible mistake. But when she looked into those storm-gray eyes and saw nothing but kindness and an inexplicable certainty about their future together, she decided that maybe, just maybe, some mistakes were worth making. "Come on," he said, guiding her toward the warmth of his home. "Let's get you dry and fed, and then we can talk about the rest." The interior of Kodiak's ranch house was nothing like Celestine had expected. Instead of the rough bachelor quarters she'd imagined, she found herself in a home that spoke of comfort and careful attention to detail. Hand-carved furniture gleamed with beeswax polish, Native American rugs covered polished wood floors, and everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of a man who valued beauty as much as function. "This is lovely," she said, wrapping the wool blanket he'd given her more tightly around her shoulders. Her wedding dress lay in a sodden heap by the door, and she wore one of his shirts that hung on her like a tent. "My mother's touch," Kodiak admitted, stirring something fragrant in a pot on the massive stone fireplace. "She passed 5 years ago, but I've tried to keep things the way she would have wanted." The grief in his voice was carefully controlled, but Celestine heard it anyway. "I'm sorry for your loss. She would have liked you," he said simply, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. "She always said the house was too quiet, needed the sound of children's laughter to make it complete." The casual mention of children made Celestine's cheeks burn. "Mr. Stormwright Kodiak," he corrected, settling into the chair across from her at the kitchen table. "And before you tell me again how crazy this all is, let me ask you something. What did you feel when Matthias proposed?" The question caught her off guard. "I felt relieved, I suppose. Grateful. Like I was finally going to have the security I'd always wanted." "And when he kissed you?" She stared down at her bowl, uncomfortable with the direction of his questions. "That's rather personal. Humor me. Felt ... Nothing pleasant enough, I suppose, but nothing earth-shaking." She looked up at him defiantly. "Not everyone experiences grand passion, Mr. Kodiak. Some of us are content with companionship and mutual respect. Are you?" His gray eyes seemed to look right through her. "Content with that?" Before she could answer, he reached across the table and took her hand in his. The contact was electric literally. She felt a jolt of sensation shoot up her arm and settle somewhere in her chest, making her breath catch. "That," he said quietly, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "is what you should feel when the right man touches you." She jerked her hand back as if burned. "That's just ... proximity. Gratitude for your kindness." He smiled, and the expression transformed his harsh features into something devastatingly attractive. "Want to test that theory?" "Absolutely not." But even as she said it, her treacherous body was remembering the warmth of his touch, the way his simple caress had awakened something she'd thought didn't exist. "Tell me about your life before today," he said, apparently deciding not to press his advantage. "What brought you to Montana?" Grateful for the change of subject, Celestine found herself talking about growing up in Boston as the daughter of a failed merchant, about the genteel poverty that had driven her west in search of opportunities, about the teaching position that had seemed like salvation and the engagement that had promised security. And now, Kodiak asked when she finished. Now, I have nothing. The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. No job, the school board won't want a scandal-ridden spinster teaching their children. No savings, no prospects. She laughed humorlessly. Suppose I could wire my aunt in Boston and beg for train fare home, assuming she'd even respond? Or, Kodiak said carefully, you could stay here. It's what? Your charity case? As my wife? The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Celestine set down her spoon with hands that shook slightly. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. He leaned forward, his massive frame somehow managing not to seem threatening despite his size. I'm 32 years old, Celestine. I've built this ranch from nothing, turned it into one of the most profitable operations in the territory. I have everything a man could want except the one thing that matters most, someone to share it with. You don't know me. I know enough. I know you're brave enough to travel halfway across the country alone for a chance at a better life. I know you're kind of seen how you are with the children you teach. I know you're intelligent and capable. His voice softened. That when I touch you, you feel the same fire I do. Physical attraction isn't enough to build a marriage on. It's a damn good start. He stood and moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked landscape. My parents had an arranged marriage, met on their wedding day. But they built something. Beautiful together, love, respect, partnership. They created a life that mattered, and you think we could do the same? I think we'd be fools not to try. He turned back to her, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. I'm not offering you charity, Celestine. I'm offering you partnership. A chance to build something meaningful together. The proposal was tempting in ways that terrified her. She'd spent her entire adult life seeking security, and here was a man offering her exactly that. But more than security, he was offering her purpose, partnership, and the kind of passion she'd only read about in books. What would people say? We barely know each other. People say we're smart enough to recognize a good thing when we see it. His smile was wry. Besides, half the marriages in the territory started with less courtship than we've had today. If it doesn't work, if we marry and discover we're completely incompatible, then we'll figure it out as we go. Marriage isn't about finding someone perfect, Celestine. It's about finding someone worth working toward perfection with. The rain continued to pound against the windows as she considered his offer. She could return to Boston in shame, become a burden on relatives who'd already made it clear she wasn't welcome. She could try to find work in another town, assuming word of today's humiliation didn't follow her. Or she could take a leap of faith with a man who looked at her like she was precious. If I agreed, she said slowly, what would you expect? What kind of marriage? A real one? In every sense. His cheeks darkened, but his gaze never wavered. I want children, Celestine, sons and daughters, to carry on what we've built. I want a partner in business, as well as life. I want... He paused, seeming to search for words. I want what my parents had. Love that grows stronger every day, built on friendship and respect and shared dreams. And if love doesn't come, it will. His certainty was absolute. It's already starting, if you're honest with yourself. Before she could deny it, he crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, his large hands framing her face with surprising gentleness. Let me court you properly, he said softly. Give me a week to prove we could be happy together. If you still want to leave after that, I'll personally escort you anywhere you want to go. Looking into his storm-gray eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch, Celestine realized she was already half in love with this impossible man. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a sense of rightness she'd never experienced before. Gotta. 1 week, she whispered. 1 week, he agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that made her forget every reason why this was a terrible idea. Morning brought clarity and panic in equal measure. Celestine woke in the guest bedroom to find her wedding dress had been cleaned and mended with careful stitches hanging like a white ghost in the corner. Someone Kodiak, she realized with a flutter of something warm in her chest, had taken care of her ruined gown. While she slept, the smell of coffee and bacon drew her downstairs, where she found him at the stove, somehow managing to look graceful despite his enormous size. He'd changed into fresh work clothes, a blue cotton shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders and dark trousers that emphasized his powerful build. "Sleep well?" he asked without turning around, but she caught the smile in his voice. Than expected. She accepted the coffee cup he offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The same electric jolt shot through her, and from his slight intake of breath, she knew he felt it too. "Thank you." "For the dress, I mean? You didn't have to." Seemed ashamed to let such a beautiful gown go to waste. His gray eyes met hers. Over the rim of his cup, "Thought you might want to wear it again someday, for a different wedding." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Presumptuous of you." "Hopeful," he corrected. "There's a difference." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A small group of riders was making their way up the ranch road, led by a thin man in a dark suit who sat his horse like someone unaccustomed to riding. "Trouble?" Celestine asked, noting how Kodiak's expression had hardened. "Remains to be seen." He moved to the gun rack by the door, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "That's Mayor Blackstone and the church council. Probably hear about yesterday's excitement." She'd been so caught up in Kodiak's impossible proposal that she'd forgotten about the scandal she'd created by fleeing the church. By now, the entire town would know about Matthias's abandonment and her dramatic exit. "Maybe I should hide," she said weakly. "You'll do no such thing." Kodiak's voice carried the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. You're not the one who broke promises and abandoned responsibilities." The riders pulled up in front of the house, Mayor Blackstone's pale face already set in lines of disapproval. Behind him rode Reverend Mitchell, Sheriff Hawkins, and two other men Celestine recognized as prominent townspeople. "Mr. Stormwright," the mayor called without dismounting, "we need to speak with you about the ... situation." Kodiak stepped onto the porch, his presence immediately dominating the space. "What situation would that be, Mayor?" "Don't play innocent. The whole town's talking about how you kidnapped that poor girl after her ordeal yesterday. Some folks are saying you took advantage of her vulnerable state. Is that what they're saying?" Kodiak's voice was dangerously quiet. "What does the poor girl herself say about it?" Celestine appeared in the doorway before anyone could answer, her chin raised in defiance despite the tremor in her hands. She'd changed into a simple blue dress borrowed from what must have been his mother's wardrobe, and with her hair neatly braided, she looked every inch the respectable schoolteacher she'd once been. "The poor girl says she came here of her own. Free will," she announced clearly. "Mr. Stormwright has been nothing but a perfect gentleman." Mayor Blackstone's thin lips pursed in disapproval. "Miss Ravencrest, you must understand how this appears. An unmarried woman spending the night alone with a bachelor. It's not proper. Your reputation, my reputation, was destroyed the moment Matthias Caldwell abandoned me at the altar." Celestine interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. At least Mr. Stormwright had the decency to offer shelter to someone in need. "Nevertheless," Reverend Mitchell interjected, "the appearance of impropriety can be easily resolved," Kodiak said quietly. "Celestine has agreed to become my wife." The announcement hit the group like a physical blow. Several men actually swayed in their saddles, while Mayor Blackstone's face went white, then red, then white again. That's impossible," he sputtered. "You barely know each other." "Bwee!" "Know enough." Kodiak moved to stand behind Celestine, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "The wedding will take place this Sunday." "Absolutely not." The mayor's voice cracked with outrage. "I won't allow this farce. The woman is clearly not in her right mind, and you're taking advantage. Careful." "Blackstone." Kodiak's voice dropped 20 degrees. "You're talking about my future wife." Sheriff Hawkins, a practical man who'd watched Kodiak grow from boy to formidable rancher, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Now, let's all calm down here. Miss Ravencrest, are you entering into this engagement of your own free will?" "I am," Celestine said firmly, surprised to realize she meant it. Mr. Stormwright has made me an honorable proposal, which I have accepted. You see? Kodiak's smile held no warmth. Everything proper and above board. Reverend Mitchell, I trust you'll be available to perform the ceremony Sunday afternoon? The Reverend looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. How well that is. The banns haven't been posted, and there are procedures. The territorial governor gave me special dispensation to marry whenever I choose, as compensation. For my service to the territory? Kodiak said smoothly. I'm sure you'll find the paperwork in order. It was a masterful lie, delivered with such confidence that even Celestine almost believed it. The officials exchanged uncertain glances, clearly out of their depth when dealing with a man of Kodiak's wealth and influence. I still say this is highly irregular, Mayor Blackstone muttered, but his bluster had lost its force. Your objection is noted and dismissed, Kodiak replied. Unless you have official business here, I suggest you gentlemen move along. My fiancé and I have wedding plans to discuss. The group departed with obvious reluctance, leaving behind a wake of muttered complaints and sideways glances. Only when they disappeared from sight did Celestine allow her shoulders to slump. Well, she said weakly, that's done it. No going back now? Having second thoughts? She turned to face him, studying the concern in his storm-gray eyes. Shouldn't you be the one having second thoughts? You just committed to marrying a woman who comes with enough scandal to choke a horse? Let them talk. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. In 6 months they'll have found someone else to gossip about. But we'll still be building something beautiful together. You really believe that? Don't you? I know it. He leaned down until their foreheads touched. Want to know how I know? How? Because when I hold you like this, the rest of the world disappears. Because when you smile, it's like the sun coming out after a storm. Because every instinct I possess is telling me you're meant to be mine. The words should have sounded like pretty flattery, but coming from him, this solid, practical man who clearly didn't waste words on empty gestures, they carried the weight of absolute truth. Kodiak, she whispered, and then couldn't find words for the feeling swirling in her chest. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. When he kissed her this time, it was different from the night before. Deeper, more certain, full of promises that made her pulse race and her knees go weak. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. 5 days until the wedding, he said against her lips. 5 days, she agreed, and realized she was counting down rather than counting on escape. Whatever was happening between them defied logic and reason, but it felt more real than anything she'd ever experienced. Maybe love at first sight was possible. Maybe some connections transcended time and circumstance. Maybe, just maybe, she was about to marry the right man after all. The dress shop in Copperwind Falls buzzed with scandalized whispers as Celestine selected fabric for her second wedding gown in as many weeks. Word had spread like wildfire about her engagement to Kodiak Stormwright, and every woman in town seemed to have an opinion about the hasty arrangement. Silk would be more appropriate for a second marriage, suggested Mrs. Pemberton, the dressmaker, her tone carefully neutral despite the disapproval radiating from her pinched features. This isn't a second marriage, Celestine replied firmly, running her fingers over a bolt of ivory satin that reminded her of moonlight. It's my first. The ceremony last week never happened. Still, given the circumstances, ... The circumstances are that I'm marrying a good man who treats me with respect? Celestine interrupted, her voice carrying more steel than anyone expected. I see no reason to apologize for that. The shop fell silent, except for the whisper of fabric and the tick of the wall clock. Then Marietta Whitfield, the banker's wife, an unofficial leader of the town's social hierarchy, stepped forward with a calculating smile. Of course, dear, we're all very happy for you. Her tone suggested anything but happiness. Though one does wonder about the haste. Such a short courtship raises ... questions. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Celestine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, the shop door chimed with the arrival of another customer. Questions about what? Voice filled the space, his massive frame seeming to absorb all the oxygen in the room. He'd clearly ridden hard from the ranch, his dark hair wind-tossed and his clothes still bearing traces of dust from the trail. The women scattered like startled birds, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere in the shop. Only Mrs. Whitfield held her ground, though her smile became noticeably strained. "Mr. Stormwright, how? Unexpected to see you here. Not as unexpected as finding my fiancé subjected to small-town gossip," he replied, his tone pleasant enough to fool no one. "I trust you are offering congratulations on our upcoming marriage." "Of course. Though, as I was just saying to Miss Ravencrest, the haste is rather romantic." Kodiak moved to stand beside Celestine, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back. "I couldn't agree more. When you find the right person, why waste time?" Mrs. Whitfield's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, clearly struggling to find a response that wouldn't openly offend the most powerful man in the county. "The ivory satin," Celestine said into the silence, making her decision. "With pearl buttons and Belgian lace trim. I want this wedding dress to be perfect." "Excellent choice," Mrs. Pemberton said quickly, obviously grateful for the change of subject. "We'll have it ready by Saturday." As they left the shop, Kodiak offered Celestine his arm. "Trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle." She glanced up at his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "Though I appreciate the rescue. Always." His voice carried absolute certainty. "Get used to it. Ty, don't tolerate anyone disrespecting what's mine." The possessiveness in his tone should have bothered her. Instead, it sent a shiver of something that felt dangerously like arousal down her spine. She was beginning to understand that Kodiak Stormwright didn't do anything halfway, including claiming his woman. "There's something we need to discuss," she said as they walked toward where his horse waited. "About the wedding night." He stopped so abruptly she nearly stumbled. "What about it?" "I'm not." She struggled to find the right words, heat flooding her cheeks. "That is, I've never, Matthias and I never." Understanding dawned in his gray eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like fierce satisfaction. "You're saying you're innocent, completely." The admission felt like a physical relief. "I know that might disappoint you, given your experience disappoint me." He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Celestine, knowing I'll be your first. You're only ... there's no greater gift you could give me. But surely you'd prefer a woman who knows how to please a man." "I'd prefer to teach you myself." His voice dropped to that rumble that made her insides flutter. "Every touch, every kiss, every way I can make you cry out with pleasure. I want to be the one to show you all of it." Her breath caught at the raw hunger in his voice. "Kodiak ... don't worry." His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I'll be gentle with you, the first time anyway." The promise on, the implicit threat of less gentle times to come made her knees go weak. She was beginning to realize that her quiet school teacher's life had in no way prepared her for the intensity of being claimed by a man like Kodiak Stormwright. Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of another rider, dusty cowboy wearing the Stormwright brand, who looked like he'd ridden hard with urgent news. "Boss," the man called, reining in his lathered horse. "We got trouble at the north pasture. Rustlers hit us last night, made off with near 50 head. Kodiak's expression hardened instantly. "Anyone hurt?" "Tommy Briggs took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live. They killed 2 of the dogs and scattered the remuda." The cowboy's jaw worked with suppressed anger. "Looks like professional work. They knew exactly what they were doing. Round up the boys. We'll track them at first light." Kodiak turned to Celestine, his gray eyes already distant with planning. "I need to handle this, of course." She tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. They'd planned to spend the afternoon together, but ranch business came first. It always would. "This could take a few days," he warned. "The wedding will happen as planned." Her voice carried more certainty than she felt. "Just ... be careful." Something in her tone made him focus on her completely. "You worried about me? Should I be?" "No." His smile was fierce and confident. "But I like that you are." He kissed her then, right there on Main Street with half the town watching, a claiming that left no doubt about who she belonged to. When he pulled away, her lips were tingling and her heart was racing. 3 days, he said against her mouth. Then you're mine forever. 3 days, she agreed, watching as he swung into his saddle with fluid grace, as the two men rode out of town. Celestine touched her lips where his kiss still burned. She was falling in love with a man she barely knew, agreeing to marry him despite every rational objection her mind could produce. But watching him ride away to face danger on her behalf, she realized that her heart had already made its choice. She just hoped he'd come back to claim her. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors to the boarding house where she was staying. Sheriff Hawkins appeared at her door looking uncomfortable, accompanied by a stranger in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Attorney Morrison from the territorial capital. Miss Ravencrest, the lawyer began without preamble. I've been retained to investigate irregularities in your recent engagement to Mr. Stormwright. What kind of irregularities? Questions have been raised about your mental state, given the traumatic events of last week. Some concerned citizens worry you're not capable of making such an important decision so soon after your ... disappointment. Ice formed in Celestine's stomach. Who retained you? I'm not at liberty to say, but I've been authorized to offer you safe passage to any destination of your choice, plus funds to start a new life elsewhere. He withdrew an envelope from his coat. $1,000, more than enough to establish yourself in a new community where your past won't follow you. And all I have to do is abandon my engagement, simply delay it until you've had time to properly consider your options. A year, perhaps 2, to ensure you're making the right choice. Celestine looked from the lawyer to the sheriff, seeing the trap being laid for her. Someone, probably Mayor Blackstone or one of his cronies, was trying to separate her from Kodiak, using legal means since intimidation had failed. My answer is no, she said firmly. I'm marrying Kodiak Stormwright this Sunday, and no amount of money will change my mind. Miss Ravencrest, please consider. I have considered. Now please leave. Attorney Morrison's expression hardened. I'm afraid I can't do that. I have a court order authorizing a mental competency evaluation. Dr. Hartwell will be arriving tomorrow to conduct the assessment. Papers he produced looked official enough, bearing the seal of the territorial court. Celestine's hands shook as she read the legal language that essentially branded her as potentially unstable. This is ridiculous, she said. I'm perfectly sane. Then you have nothing to worry about, the lawyer replied smoothly. The evaluation is simply a formality to protect your interests. But Celestine recognized the trap. A mental competency hearing could drag on for weeks, easily past the wedding date. By the time she was declared sane, public opinion would have turned completely against both her and Kodiak. As the men left, she sank into a chair and tried to think. Kodiak was gone chasing rustlers, unaware that their enemies were attacking. From a different direction, she was alone, facing forces determined to destroy her chance at happiness, but she wasn't the helpless victim they assumed her to be. She'd survived traveling across the country alone, had built a successful teaching career from nothing, had endured humiliation and betrayal with her dignity intact. She wasn't about to let a group of small-minded men destroy her future now, standing. She moved to the writing desk and began composing a telegram. If they wanted to play legal games, she'd show them she could play too, and when Kodiak returned, he'd find his bride to be ready to fight for their love. The telegraph key clicked rapidly under Celestine's fingers as she sent urgent messages to every contact she could think of, former colleagues from Boston, fellow teachers she'd met during her journey west, even distant relatives who might have influence in legal circles. If Attorney Morrison wanted to play games with court orders and competency hearings, she'd demonstrate just how competent she really was. By evening, responses began arriving. Her former headmistress in Boston confirmed Celestine's exemplary character and sound judgment. A judge she'd met through her father's business affairs vouched for her mental stability. Most importantly, a women's rights advocate in Denver promised to send a lawyer to represent her interests. Fighting back? Are you? Sheriff Hawkins appeared in the telegraph office as she finished sending her messages. Might be easier to just take Morrison's offer and disappear. I'm sure it would be easier for whoever's paying him, Celestine replied, without looking up from her correspondence. But I don't run from fights anymore. This isn't your fight, miss. This is about politics and power. Things bigger than one. Woman's feelings, you're wrong. She finally faced him, her green eyes blazing with determination. This is about my right to choose my own future. And I choose Kodiak Stormwright. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Miss, there are things you don't understand about the politics in this territory. People with money and influence who don't like seeing their plans disrupted. What plans? Stormwright's ranch sits on some of the best water rights in the territory. There's been talk of a railroad spur, mining interests, development that could make certain people very wealthy. He lowered his voice. Word is that your former fiancé's flight wasn't as spontaneous as it appeared. Some folks wanted you discredited, wanted Stormwright isolated and distracted. The implications hit her like a physical blow. You're saying Matthias was paid to abandon me? I'm saying there are powerful men who benefit when someone like Stormwright is kept from forming alliances. Through marriage? Hawkins glanced around the empty telegraph office. A man with a wife, especially a smart one who might help him navigate political waters, becomes much harder to manipulate. Celestine felt pieces clicking into place. That's why they're so determined. To stop this wedding, it's not about my reputation. It's about preventing Kodiak from gaining an intelligent partner. Now you're starting to understand. The sheriff's expression was grim. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before she could answer, the office door burst open. Kodiak filled the doorway, his clothes dust-covered, and his face etched with exhaustion and fury. Behind him stood 3 of his men, all armed, and looking ready for war. Where is he? Kodiak's voice was deadly quiet as his gray eyes swept the room. Who? Celestine asked, though her heart leaped at seeing him safe. Morrison. The lawyer who's been threatening my future wife with fraudulent court orders stepped into the office, his presence immediately dominating the space. Tommy recognized one of the rustlers' hired gun who works for certain business. Interests in the territorial capital? The cattle theft was a diversion, meant to keep me away while they moved against you? How did you know? Got a telegram from Jenkins at the bank. He's been watching Morrison's finances. Someone paid him a substantial sum to file those competency papers. Kodiak's jaw worked with suppressed rage. Where is he staying? Sheriff Hawkins cleared his throat. No, Kodiak, you can't. What? Protect my woman from legal harassment? Kodiak's attention fixed on the lawman with laser intensity. Seems to me you should be investigating who's filing false court documents and bribing officials. I don't have jurisdiction over territorial matters, then I'll handle it myself. Kodiak, no. Celestine stepped between him and the door, her hands coming to rest on his chest. Violence won't solve this. It'll only give them more ammunition to use against us. Then what do you suggest? His hands covered hers, and she felt the tension thrumming through his powerful frame like a coiled spring. Let them destroy you with lies and legal tricks. I suggest we beat them at their own game. She looked up at him with fierce determination. I've been fighting back all day. I have character witnesses, legal representation coming from Denver, and evidence that Morrison's court order is fraudulent. That could take weeks to sort through, and we don't wait for the courts. A plan was forming in her mind, audacious and risky, but potentially brilliant. When is Morrison's competency hearing scheduled? Tomorrow afternoon, Sheriff Hawkins answered reluctantly. Perfect. Celestine's smile was sharp as a blade. Sheriff, as a duly appointed territorial official, you have the authority to perform marriage ceremonies, don't you? Well, yes, and such ceremonies are legally binding immediately upon completion? Understanding dawned in Kodiak's eyes, followed by admiration and something that looked like pride. You want to marry me before the hearing? I want to. Marry you tonight. She turned to face the sheriff. Once we're legally wed, any attempt to question my competency becomes a direct attack on my husband's judgment. And I suspect these mysterious business interests aren't quite ready. For that level of confrontation with Kodiak Stormwright? Brilliant, Kodiak breathed. Absolutely brilliant. Sheriff Hawkins looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. I don't know, the irregularity of it all. The only irregularity is allowing corrupt lawyers to harass innocent citizens, Kodiak said firmly. You can either marry us now, or explain to the territorial governor why you refuse to protect a law-abiding citizen from legal persecution. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sheriff Hawkins sighed heavily. You'll need witnesses. We've got witnesses, one of Kodiak's men called from the doorway. Half the town's gathered outside, waiting to see what happens next. Indeed, a crowd had formed in the street, drawn by the drama of Kodiak's dramatic return and the rumors swirling about legal threats and mysterious lawyers. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by now everyone in Copperwine knew that forces, beyond their understanding, were trying to destroy the territory's most eligible bachelor. What about your dress? Kodiak asked Celestine. The one we ordered? This will have to do. She gestured to her simple green traveling dress, unless you're having second thoughts about marrying a woman in such plain attire. I'd marry you. In sackcloth, if necessary. His voice was rough with emotion. Dress doesn't matter. You matter? Then let's get married. The ceremony took place right there in the telegraph office, with curious townspeople crowding around the windows and spilling out into the street. Sheriff Hawkins stumbled through the traditional words while Celestine and Kodiak stood hand in hand. Their eyes locked on each other as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Do you, Kodiak Stormwright, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? I do. The words carried absolute conviction. And do you, Celestine Ravencrest, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? Celestine looked into Kodiak's storm-gray eyes and saw her future. Stretching out before them, not the safe, predictable life she'd planned with Matthias, but something wild and passionate and real. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Sheriff Hawkins' voice carried to the crowd outside. You may kiss your bride. The kiss that followed was nothing like the chaste ceremony she'd planned for Sunday. Kodiak claimed her mouth with a passion that left no doubt about his feelings, his large hands tangling in her hair as he kissed her like a man who'd found his salvation. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the crowd outside was cheering. Mrs. Stormwright, he said against her lips, testing the sound of her new name. Mrs. Stormwright, she agreed, marveling at how right it sounded. Well, Sheriff Hawkins said dryly, I suppose that settles the competency question. A woman smart enough to outmaneuver territorial lawyers is clearly of sound mind. As if summoned by his words, Attorney Morrison appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been panic. This is irregular, he sputtered. The marriage hasn't been properly recorded. The banns weren't posted, actually. The telegraph operator spoke up from behind his key. I took the liberty of recording the ceremony and sending notification. To the territorial capital, all perfectly legal and binding.
Ow.
Morrison's face went white. This won't stand. My clients will appeal. We'll find grounds to your clients, Kodiak interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart men reconsider their life choices. Should probably worry more about the federal marshals I've contacted regarding fraudulent court documents and conspiracy to interfere with territorial land rights. You can't prove anything, can't I? Kodiak's smile was all teeth. I have the rustlers you hired in custody. Amazing how talkative men become when facing federal charges for cattle theft. They've been very forthcoming about who paid them and why. Morrison's legal bluster crumbled entirely. My clients were simply protecting legitimate business interests. Your clients were trying to manipulate federal land policy through illegal means. Kodiak stepped closer, his massive frame making the lawyer seem even smaller. Tell them that Mrs. Stormwright and I will be very interested in exposing their methods to the appropriate authorities. As Morrison fled into the night, Celestine felt a surge of satisfaction. They'd won more than a legal victory. They'd demonstrated that she and Kodiak together were a force to be reckoned with. So, she said, slipping her arm through her new husband's. What happens now? Now, Kodiak said, his gray eyes dark with promise, I take my wife home and show her exactly what she's gotten herself into. The heat in his voice made her pulse race, but she was no longer the terrified woman who'd collapsed on his stairs. Less than a week ago, She was Mrs. Kodiak Stormright, and she was ready for whatever came next. The ride back to the ranch took on an entirely different character, with Celestine seated before Kodiak on his massive stallion, her body pressed against his chest and his arms encircling her as he handled the reins. Every step of the horse created delicious friction between them. And by the time they reached the ranch house, the air practically crackled with tension. "Second thoughts?" Kodiak asked as he helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist.
About
"Marrying you? Never?" She looked up at him, marveling at how the moonlight turned his harsh features into something almost ethereal. "About what comes next? I'm terrified." "Good." His smile was gentle despite the heat in his eyes. "Fear means it matters." He swept her into his arms without warning, carrying her up the porch steps and through the front door in a display of strength that made her feel delicate and precious. The house was warm and welcoming, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Kodiak," she began, then lost her words as he set her down in the main parlor and began slowly circling her, like a predator contemplating its prey. "You know what I've been thinking about all day?" His voice was rough velvet in the lamplight. "While I was tracking rustlers and dealing with corrupt lawyers." "What? This moment, having you here in my house, wearing my name?" He stopped behind her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "Knowing that you're mine completely." She shivered as his fingers found the small buttons at the back of her dress. "Kodiak, I should tell you, I don't know what I'm doing." "I know." His breath was warm against her ear. "That's what makes this perfect. Everything you feel, every sound you make, every tremor of pleasure, it all belongs to me." The possessiveness in his voice should have alarmed her. Instead, it sent heat spiraling through her veins. She'd never realized how much she craved being claimed, being treasured, being the sole focus of such intense masculine attention. "Let me see you," he whispered, his fingers working at her buttons with surprising dexterity for such large hands.
Ow.
"All of you." The dress slipped from her shoulders like water, pooling at her feet in a whisper of fabric. She stood before him in only her chemise and corset, feeling exposed and vulnerable and more alive than she'd ever been. "Beautiful," he breathed, his hands skimming along her arms with reverent touches. "So beautiful I can barely believe you're real." "I'm real." Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm here. I'm yours." Something flared in his gray eyes at her words. "Say it again." "I'm yours, Kodiak. Completely." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like their previous embraces. This was claiming, conquering, a kiss that spoke of possession and promise and desires too powerful for words. His hands roamed her body with growing boldness, mapping every curve and hollow while she clung to his shoulders for stability. The bedroom she managed between kisses. No, his smile was wicked. "Right here. I've imagined having you in front of the fireplace too many times to wait any longer." He spread a thick fur rug before the hearth, then began undressing with efficient movements that spoke of urgent need. Celestine watched in fascination as his powerful body was revealed, broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. Muscles that spoke of years of hard physical labor, scars that told stories of a life lived fully. "You're magnificent," she said. Wonderingly, "And you," he replied, reaching for the laces of her corset, "are about to find out exactly how magnificent I can be." What followed was a claiming that was both gentle and fierce, patient and urgent. Kodiak worshipped her body with hands and mouth until she was sobbing with need, and joined with her in a union that was both physical and spiritual. The pain was brief, overwhelmed by pleasure so intense it bordered on transcendent. Afterward, they lay entwined before the dying fire, her head on his chest, while he stroked her hair with gentle fingers. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "None." She pressed a kiss to his chest, tasting salt and satisfaction. "Except that we waited so long. We've got the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." The promise sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. She was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who saw her as both precious and strong, who claimed her completely while respecting her independence. "There's something I should tell you," she said, gathering courage, "about why I really came west. Tell me, I wasn't just seeking adventure or escaping genteel poverty." She took a deep breath. "I was running from a scandal. A married man in Boston, my father's business partner, he made advances. When I refused him, he spread rumors that I'd encouraged him, that I was a woman of loose morals. No decent family would hire me after that." Kodiak's hands stilled in her hair. "What was his name?" "It doesn't matter now, his name. Celestine." The deadly quiet in his voice made her look up at him. His gray eyes held a coldness that spoke of barely leashed violence. "Harrison Pembroke," she said reluctantly. "But Kodiak, you can't." "Can, and I will." His voice was granite hard. "No one attacks my wife and walks away unscathed. It's in the past. And if he tries to retaliate, let him try." Kodiak's confidence was absolute. "He's fighting a rich man's war with a poor man's weapons. He'll lose." As they lay together in the firelight, Celestine marveled at the strange turns her life had. Taken a week ago, she'd been a disgraced schoolteacher with nowhere to turn. She was the wife of one of the territory's most powerful men, protected and cherished beyond her wildest dreams. "I love you," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Kodiak went very still. "What did you say?" "I love you." This time the words came easier, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I know it's sudden. I know it doesn't make sense, but it makes perfect sense." His voice was rough with emotion. "Because I love you, too. Have since the moment I saw you crying on my stairs. Really, really." He kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stormwright." She drifted off to sleep in his arms. Celestine realized that sometimes the best things in life came from the worst moments. Her public humiliation had led her to her true love. Her desperate flight had brought her home. And tomorrow, she'd begin building a life with a man who'd seen her at her lowest point and decided it was worth everything he had to give. 6 months later, Celestine stood on the porch of the ranch house, one hand resting on her gently rounded belly, while the other shaded her eyes as she watched. Kodiak working with a spirited new stallion in the corral. Even at a distance, she could see the easy rapport between man and horse. The way Kodiak's patience and strength gentled the animal into cooperation. "Still watching your husband like a lovesick schoolgirl, I see," came a familiar voice from behind her. She turned to find Isabella Martinez. The doctor who'd arrived in Copperwine Falls just last month and who'd become Celestine's closest friend. The petite woman with dark eyes and an irreverent sense of humor had scandalized the town by setting up practice as the territory's first female physician. "Can you blame me?" Celestine asked with a smile. "Look at him," look at Isabella said dryly, and trying not to be too obvious about it. "That husband of yours is definitely easy on the eyes." "He's also the father of my child," Celestine added, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "How are you feeling today? Any more morning sickness?" "None. I think that's finally passed." Celestine's smile turned radiant. "I can hardly believe it's real. 6 months ago, I was a spinster schoolteacher with no prospects. And now you're the wife of the most powerful rancher in the territory, expecting his child, and single-handedly reforming the local school system." Isabella's expression grew serious. "Speaking of which, I have news about the legislation you've been pushing." Celestine had spent the winter months working with other women throughout the territory to establish better educational standards and teacher training programs. Her marriage to Kodiak had given her a platform she'd never had before, and she'd used it to champion causes close to her heart. Good news? Territorial legislature passed your education reform bill. Every child in Montana Territory will now have access to quality schooling, regardless of their family's economic situation. Isabella's smile was proud. "They're calling it the Stormwright Education Act." Tears pricked Celestine's eyes. "I can hardly believe it. Your husband's political connections and your passionate advocacy made it happen." Isabella squeezed her arm. "You're making a real difference, Celestine. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a familiar buggy. Mayor Blackstone climbed down with obvious reluctance, his face set in lines of barely controlled displeasure. Behind him came Sheriff Hawkins and two other men Celestine didn't recognize. "Mrs. Stormwright," the mayor said stiffly. "Is your husband available? He's working? Is there something I can help you with? This is official business. We need to speak with Mr. Stormwright directly." Celestine's protective instincts flared. For the past months, several attempts had been made to challenge Kodiak's water rights and landholdings, all traced back to the same mysterious business interests that had tried to stop their wedding. "I'll get him," she said carefully. Kodiak appeared within minutes, alerted by one of his hands. He moved with the easy confidence that had only grown stronger since their marriage, his gray eyes taking in the group of officials with sharp assessment. "Gentlemen," he said without warmth, "what brings you to my ranch?" "Official business," Mayor Blackstone repeated. "We have a warrant to search your property." "On what grounds?" Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward reluctantly. "Allegations of harboring stolen cattle. Someone filed a complaint claiming you've been altering brands and selling stolen livestock." The accusation was so ridiculous that Celestine almost laughed. The Stormwright Ranch was known throughout the territory for its integrity and quality stock, but she could see the political maneuvering behind the charge and another attempt to harass and discredit her husband. "Who filed the complaint?" asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm not at liberty to say," one of the strangers replied. "I'm Federal Marshal Davis, and this is my deputy. We have jurisdiction in matters of interstate cattle theft." "Then you should have done your research," Celestine said, stepping forward with a leather portfolio in her hands. "Because every head of cattle on this ranch can be accounted for with proper documentation." She'd spent weeks organizing their records, creating a system that tracked every animal from birth to sale. What had started as a way to help Kodiak manage his growing operation had become an ironclad defense against false accusations. Furthermore, she continued, spreading papers on the porch table. "We have sworn statements from every buyer who's purchased livestock from this ranch, confirming the legitimacy of all transactions." Marshal Davis examined the documents with growing amazement. "This is extraordinarily detailed." "My wife believes in being thorough," Kodiak said, pride evident in his voice. "There's more," Celestine added, producing another set of papers. "I've also documented every instance of harassment this ranch has faced over the past 6 months, false legal challenges, fraudulent court orders, mysterious cattle thefts that coincidentally occurred when important business was being conducted. Would you like to see the pattern that emerges?" The federal marshal's expression grew increasingly grim as he studied her evidence. "Mrs. Stormwright, are you suggesting a conspiracy?" "I'm presenting facts and letting you draw your own conclusions," she replied diplomatically. "But it does seem curious that every challenge to our operations can be traced back to the same group of investors who've been trying to acquire water rights in this valley." "This is outrageous," Mayor Blackstone sputtered. "You can't just make wild accusations, actually." "She can," Marshal Davis interrupted. "And based on this evidence, I think the federal government needs to investigate some of these accusations more thoroughly." He turned to Kodiak with newfound respect. "Mr. Stormwright, I apologize for the intrusion. Your records are impeccable, and there's clearly no basis for the cattle theft allegations." "And the real thieves?" Kodiak asked. "Will be pursued with the full force of federal law," the marshal promised, "along with anyone who's been filing false complaints to harass legitimate ranchers." As the officials departed, Mayor Blackstone, looking like he'd swallowed a particularly unpleasant tonic, Kodiak wrapped his arms around his wife from behind. "Have I mentioned lately that you're brilliant?" he murmured against her ear. "Only every day." She leaned back against his solid warmth, marveling at how safe and loved she felt in his arms. "Think this will finally put an end to the harassment?" "I think our enemies are about to discover they picked the wrong couple to mess with." His hands came to rest on her belly, covering their growing child with gentle protection. "How's our little one today? Active?" "I think he's going to be a fighter like his father. Or she's going to be brilliant like her mother," Kodiak countered. "Either way, this child is going to grow up knowing exactly how precious love is." 6 months ago, Celestine had thought her life was over. Now, standing in the arms of the man who'd rescued her from despair and built a future with her that exceeded her wildest dreams, realized it had just begun. "I love you, Kodiak Stormwright. she said, turning in his arms to face him. "And I love you, Mrs. Stormwright." His kiss was soft and full of promise, forever and always. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together on the porch of their home, a man who'd found his heart's desire sitting on his stairs, and a woman who'd discovered that sometimes the worst moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Their love story had started with tears and would continue with joy, built on a foundation of trust, respect, and the kind of passion that burns eternal. And someday, they'd tell their children about the night a crying woman on the stairs became the love of a giant cowboy's life.